It is really my distinct privilege to honor and recognize and welcome Mr. David Rubenstein. Mr. Rubenstein co-founded the Carlyle Group in 1987, and since then the firm has grown to manage $223 billion with offices in 33 countries, 33 offices around the globe. That said, Mr. Rubenstein's achievements extend well beyond his professional accomplishments. Currently, he serves as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a fellow of the Harvard Corporation and a trustee of the National Gallery of Art, the University of Chicago, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Johns Hopkins Medicine, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Brookings Institution, and the World Economic Forum. Mr. Rubenstein is also a director of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts and the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, and president of the Economic Club of Washington. That's just some of the things he's doing. That's not everything. I learned about more a little while ago. An original signer of the Giving Pledge, Mr. Rubenstein has made significant contributions to all of the organizations I just mentioned and more. He is the recipient of the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy and MoMA's David Rockefeller Award, among other philanthropic recognition. I think what distinguishes his philanthropy and leadership is that he has also focused in on patriotic philanthropy. He is making transformative gifts for the restoration or repair of many monuments that are dear to our country's history, including the Washington Monument, Monticello, Montpelier, Mount Vernon, Arlington House, Iwo Jima Memorial, the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian, thank you for the pandas, the National Archives, the National Zoo, the Library of Congress, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Mr. Rubenstein has also provided the United States government with long-term loans of his rare copies of the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the first map of the United States, the Abel Buell map, and the first book that was printed in the United States, the Bay Psalm Book. And as yet another wonderful example of his philanthropic spirit, Mr. Rubenstein has donated a copy of his book, The American Story, to everyone here in the audience. You'll see the books. You'll see the books are located on your table. There's one for everyone. And we hope that you'll enjoy reading it as you gather with your family and friends this holiday season, and you find a little more inspiration and you learn something a little bit more about our country. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and honor to introduce to you the co-founder and CEO of the Carlyle Group, David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for that kind introduction. And please lower your expectations that the speech won't be as good as the introduction. I'm just curious to see how many people here are natives of Florida. Okay. How many people came down here from the Northeast or the Midwest in the last 10 or 20 years? Okay, wow. How many people are just snowbirds who happen to be here right now? Anybody? Okay. How many people here think Florida is the best state to live? Right? Okay. How many people think every time I come it rains? Okay. So I actually have been coming here for about 50 plus years because my mother was born in West Palm Beach, Florida, and grew up here. And so eventually she moved to Baltimore, where I was born, and gradually, after my father retired, as I'll talk about it more, they moved to what I call a suburb of Baltimore, West Palm Beach, Florida, and lived here for some time. And I've been coming down here for about 50 years, every year intending to buy a house, and every year I say the prices are a little bit higher than I think they should be. I'll wait till next year. So I've been waiting for 50 years, and the prices haven't gone down, so eventually I'll get it done. So how many people here, I'm just curious, think the U.S. economy is in good shape? Okay. All right, how many people here think that Donald Trump will be reelected president? Okay. How many people think Donald Trump will carry Florida? Okay. All right, how many people here think the U.S. Congress is doing a good job? Oh, wow. Okay, well, let me talk about the Congress for a moment before I get into what I really wanted to talk about. But let me talk about the Congress for a moment, and in this respect, because it deals with the book that you have in front of you. And let me describe what it is and how it came about. My firm, the Carlyle Group, is a firm that, when it was getting off the ground, nobody ever heard of Rubenstein, and so to get people to come to the events, I had to go out and hire big speakers. So I would go hire former presidents of the United States, secretaries of state, and I'd pay them a big fee, $100,000, $200,000. Jim Baker calls this white-collar crime because you're, a former government official. You get to make a speech. You don't say anything that's really novel, but you get paid a lot of money for it. It turns out that a lot of these former government officials are not that great speakers. So they would come and I'd pay them $200,000 and the audience is looking at their watch all the time, and I'm realizing I'm spending a lot of money, I'm not getting the benefits. So I said to a lot of these people in the speaking agents, why don't I interview these people? I can make it maybe more interesting and people wouldn't find it so deadly dull. And the speakers would say, the former secretaries of state, the former presidents, well, am I going to get paid the same fee? Yes. Okay, I'm happy to do the interview. Okay. So I started interviewing them, and it was modestly funny and so forth, so people liked it. So a man heard about it named Vernon Jordan, and he said, David, I want you to become the president of the Economic Club of Washington and bring speakers in as well there. Now, Vernon is a very prominent person, and I live in Washington. I never even heard of the Economic Club of Washington. I told him I didn't know what it was. He said, it's just 100 people. You bring in a speaker once a quarter. You get them to come in. All you have to do is get them to make the speech. You get the questions from the members. You read them in the cards, and that's it. I said, okay. So once again, I got people to speak. Once again, they were terrible speakers. The business CEOs were no better than former secretaries of state, and the people were falling asleep. The questions came up from the members, and I'm reading the cards, and they were terrible. So I pretended I'm reading the questions when I was making them up, and they were funny. So eventually I said, I'm going to junk this format just like as at Carlyle, and I would just interview people. And I started interviewing them. That was about 10 years ago. I've done about 150 of them. And then some people at Mike Bloomberg's operation, Bloomberg, saw it and said, David, why don't you put this on television? And just interview CEOs. So I started doing that a couple years ago, and when we got started, I said to Mike Bloomberg, what's the name of the show going to be? And he said, how about the David Rubenstein Show? And I said, Mike, a long Jewish name is not going to really work. And he said, no, I don't think it's a problem. So we started it, and now it's been going on for a while, and it led me to think about trying to educate people through the interview process in one specific area, and that's history. And let me describe what I mean. Right now, we don't teach history very much to our students as much as we used to, and as a result, you get surveys that show things like this. 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 75% of Americans, when asked, what are the 3 branches of government, cannot do so. 1/3 of Americans cannot even name 1 branch of government. More high school sophomores can name the first 3 names of the 3 Stooges than the first 3 names of any founding fathers. 35% of Americans think that George Washington crossed the Rhine River during the Revolutionary War. 30% of Americans think that in the Civil War, they can't name within 20 years which way the Civil War occurred, which decade the Civil War occurred. 30% of Americans cannot name within 20 years when the Civil War occurred. 20% of Americans think that Dwight Eisenhower was a general during the Civil War. 35% of Americans think that Larry Summers was the first Treasury Secretary. And 10% of college graduates think that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court, which I say is not yet the case. Are there any naturalized Americans here? Any naturalized American citizens? Okay. So if you're a naturalized American citizen, you realize that now you have to live in the United States for 5 years. It used to be 14 years. You live in the United States for 5 years, and then you take a test. The test has 100 questions. You have to pass 60 of them. And you presumably study for it a bit. The questions are not that difficult. Who was the first president of the United States and so forth. 91% of the naturalized citizen candidates who take this test pass. 91% pass. The same test was given recently to by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation to native-born Americans in all 50 states, and you can predict the results. In 49 out of 50 states, native-born Americans could not pass the basic citizenship test that naturalized citizen candidates have to take, which shows you we don't teach civics and history very much because, we're concerned about STEM and so forth, so we don't really know much about our history. And now, why is that important? Why should we care about it? Well, there's a theory that if you learn the past, you might be able to avoid the mistakes in the future. And there's a famous Harvard historian named George Santayana who said, those people who don't remember the past are condemned to relive it in the future. So while history isn't everything, it's important to know. And unfortunately, today, of all the people in college today, only 2% of the males are majoring in history. Only 1% of females are majoring in history. So we don't really have a lot of history majors coming out of colleges these days, and presumably we don't know as much about our own history as we should. So toward that end, I thought, who would be most important to learn about our history than our members of Congress, because they're making the laws. And wouldn't it be good if they knew more about history? So I decided I would start a program about 6 years ago to educate members of Congress about history. Not, of course, that they don't know a lot about it, but maybe they could learn a little bit more. So I would take the best historians in our country, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, John Meacham, Ron Chernow, and bring them to the Library of Congress, which is neutral territory, and members can go there through underground tunnels so they can get there relatively easily. And once a month, I will interview at a dinner that I host one of these great historians. And I decided to put together a number of the interviews and put them in this book. And basically, it's an easy read because you can go through the interviews of these great historians and learn more about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson and so forth. And I wouldn't say this is a comprehensive history of America. There's some great books out that are comprehensive. Jill Lepore has a terrific book out called These Truths, but that's 900 pages, takes a while to get through. This is a little bit easier to get through for those who don't have the time to read her book, though I read it and it's a great book. So let me just tell you one or two stories about it before I get on to the part of the speech that I was going to talk about before I talked about the book. One of the people I wanted to interview was the Chief Justice of the United States. As you heard, I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian, and I assume many of you have been to the Smithsonian. It's 19 museums, 9 research centers, and the National Zoo. And the Chancellor of the Smithsonian is actually the Chief Justice of the United States, so he and I work together closely. So I said to the Chief Justice, would you mind if I interviewed you in front of these members of Congress, even though you're not a historian? And he said, well, I have some background in it, and I thought even though members of Congress don't really deal with the Chief Justice, they should know more about how the Supreme Court operates. So I said at the beginning to the Chief Justice, and he's a very, very smart man. He went to Harvard, summa cum laude in 3 years, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, clerked in the Supreme Court for Justice Rehnquist, and a really brilliant person. So I said to him at the beginning of the interview, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States when you were little? He said, no, I didn't want that. Well, did you want to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court when you were little? No, I didn't want that either. Well, did you want to be a judge of any type? Well, no, I didn't want that either. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? Well, I didn't want that either. Well, what did you want to be? I only wanted to be a historian. I only cared about American history. That's what I loved. And I told my father, I only want to be a historian. My father said, John, there's no money in being a historian. You'll write books, nobody ever read them, and you won't be able to support a family. And John said, I don't really care. All I want to do is study American history and write about it. So John's father said, okay. He went off to Harvard and he studied history. Came back from his spring break, the sophomore year, got off in the cab, got into a cab at Logan Airport and said to the cab driver, could you please take me to Cambridge? And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. The cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So he went to law school. Actually, John is a very smart guy. John Roberts is a very smart guy. But the first day he went to work in the White House, before he became a judge, he went to work at the White House under Ronald Reagan. He was an associate deputy general counsel. And at the first day, one of his friends came in and said, well, congratulations. On the first day at the White House, President Reagan is going to call you, so wait for the call. And he likes to welcome everybody the first day. So sure enough, 5 minutes later, an operator gets on the phone and says, is this John Roberts? Yes. Please hold for the President. President Reagan will be on in a moment. John Roberts saying, wow, it's great. I never met the President. He's going to call me my first day. It's great. So he's waiting 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. He figures maybe Gorbachev is calling. Maybe there's some big problem. Then 35 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. Finally, after 50 minutes, he's still holding. He hears laughter in the hallway. It turns out it was a prank. They wanted to bet how long he would wait to see. Okay. One of the authors in the book is one of the greatest American authors. Some of you know him, David McCullough. Yeah. Now, David McCullough looks like Mr. America in some ways. He looks like his face should be up on Mount Rushmore. He's written these terrific books. Some of you probably read them. John Adams won the Pulitzer Prize. Harry Truman won the Pulitzer Prize. A book on the Wright brothers, most recent, The Pioneers. He's now about, I think, 86 years old, still going strong, and I've interviewed him several times. And he told me that his style of writing is a little different than some other authors. Some authors have a style where you write 300 words a day. Edmund Morris, who just came out with a book on Edison, unfortunately he passed away very recently, he would write 300 words a day, and that's it. Then other people will say, Andrew Roberts, who wrote a book on Churchill, which is 1,000 pages, he would write from 8 in the morning to midnight, just no writer's block, just keep going. David McCullough's way is he has a partner, his wife, of 65 years, and he writes a paragraph and he gives it to her and she reads it back to him. He wants to make sure it sounds right as well as reads right. So in one book, I think it was the John Adams book, he wrote out a paragraph and gave it to Rosalie, his wife, and Rosalie read it back and he said it sounds okay. Okay. She said, no, there's a sentence in there, I don't think it really works. He said, oh, read it again. And she read it again. He said, no, it's okay. No, she said, that sentence really, I don't think it works. He said, read it again. Read it again. It's okay. No, it's not. God damn it, it's okay. Leave it in. Okay. So the book comes out, wins the Pulitzer Prize. Gore Vidal writes a review. This is one of the greatest biographies I've ever read. David McCullough is the greatest writer I've ever seen, but he has this one sentence in this book that just doesn't make any sense. So I hope you'll enjoy the book. It's really a kind of an easy walk through American history with some of our greatest authors, and I'm happy to answer questions about one or more of the presidents before I get on to the main thing that after I talk about the main thing I wanted to talk about. But let me talk about the main subject I wanted to talk about, really, which is how I got here and my lucky life. And here's my background, and it's a story that may resonate with some of you. You may have similar backgrounds to mine. As I mentioned, my mother was actually from here, but she came to Baltimore, and there she met my father. My father had dropped out of high school to go into Marines in World War II. He came back, and at the age of 20, he met my mother, and she was 17. So he dropped out of high school to go in the Marines. He came back, he met my mother. She dropped out of high school, married at 17. 20 and 17 seems very young to get married to me today, but they did. More than 9 months later, I was born, and I was their only child. And I grew up in Baltimore. Anybody from Baltimore here? Okay, so Baltimore, as you may or may not know, it was the most rigidly segregated city in the United States by religion. As some of you may know, the Supreme Court in 1948, in a case called Shelley v. Kramer, outlawed mortgages that were restrictive. Restrictive mortgages mean you can't sell a home to somebody who's black or Jewish. But Baltimore never quite got the word. So in the mid-50s, if you were Jewish, you had to live in a very Jewish ghetto area. And I didn't know anybody who wasn't Jewish until I was 13. I thought everybody in the world is Jewish. Then I realized virtually nobody in the world is Jewish, relatively speaking. But I grew up in this little Jewish ghetto, and everybody was in a row house. And these row houses were relatively modest. And there was 800 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, no air conditioning, very modest homes. In fact, I took my son when he was 8 years old to show him what a modest house I grew up in, and I went to this row house that I'd grown up in, and there were about 12 houses, and I was in the middle of one of them. And I said, see, Andrew, look at this little house I grew up in. He said, Dad, what's so small about it? There are 12 doors there in that house. I said, no, that's 12 separate houses. But the advantage of growing up with modest means, to be honest, is that if you have the unconditional love of your parents, you can achieve almost anything you want. And I was fortunate. My parents put all their energy into their only child. If you grow up in a wealthier family, it's a little more complicated because, as you all know, if you have wealth, it can not be an unmitigated blessing at sometimes when you're raising children. Now, 2 of my children are here, and they would say, the money's not so bad, but but the truth is, it's much more complicated to grow up in a wealthy family. So I realized, and this was the greatest thing that I got out of my youth, which is if I was going to get anywhere, I had to really do it on my own. But I didn't want to go into private equity when I was young, although I've called private equity the highest calling of mankind. At the time, I didn't know what private equity was when I was a little boy. And they didn't have hedge funds in those days. They didn't have tech startups. So if you were Jewish and you were growing up in a place like Baltimore, your parents' highest aspirations for you were to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a My mother's ambition for me was to be a dentist. She thought, you get to be called a doctor, no weekend hours, and she had a lot of dental needs, so she figured it'd be great. I said, I might get arthritis in my fingers. I'm not sure this would work for me. So ultimately, it was either being a doctor or a lawyer. And I decided in the 6th grade I really wanted to be a lawyer, and this is the reason. Some of you may remember this. John Kennedy gave a speech on January 20th, 1961. It was the greatest presidential inaugural speech, in my view, in the 20th century. And John Kennedy was not a gifted speaker, to be honest. He really had speech problems over the years. He had a lot of speaking coaches, but this one was the greatest speech he ever given. And he historically has seen as not a good speaker because he would look down, he didn't look up, and he had this accent that people couldn't understand. But this speech really nailed it, and it was only a 14-minute speech. It was about 2,000 words. And he said, as you may remember, he had a signature line. He was a big fan of Winston Churchill. And Churchill, when he wrote a speech, always said, I want to have a signature line that people remember. Always have something people remember. And John Kennedy's signature line was, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that was what people remember from that speech. There were other great lines in that speech, so that's what people remember. And my teacher in the 6th grade went over that word for word, line for line with my classmates and me, and I realized it was really poetry in prose form. It was a wonderful speech, but it inspired me to say, I want to give back to my country. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I thought you go into government, you serve your country, and that was a great ambition to do. And so I ultimately went to college. I got a scholarship to go to Duke University. It was not a basketball scholarship, I assure you. The only person in Duke's history to get cut from an intramural basketball team when there are only 4 other people on the team. I applied to a lot of law schools, and and some of you may recognize this. I often say, if any of you went to college or high school, you never know who's going to turn out to be successful afterwards. Nobody would have predicted I was going to be a great success when I was in high school. I did okay, but nothing great. College, okay, but nothing great. And if you had voted who was the least likely person to become the chairman of the board at Duke University later on, it would have been me. I would never have thought I would have gotten there, but that's because very often the superstars, when you're young, they kind of fade a bit, and they get tired of all the success, and they don't work as hard. And the greatest thing you can do is keep working hard. And so if you don't win the first third of life, maybe you get lucky in the second or third if you keep working hard. And so I kept working hard with modest, capabilities, but I just thought if I worked hard, I could get somewhere. So I applied to a lot of law schools, and I really couldn't afford to go to a good law school. But I got a full scholarship to a law school, and in the place I'd never been. It's called the University of Chicago. And great school, but I had never been west of Hagerstown, Maryland. And so I applied there because I got somebody gave me the application. I get in, they said, Mr. Rubenstein, you got a full scholarship. I said, wow. So I called my parents and I got a full scholarship. They said, send in the $50, you reserve your place. Okay. Next day, send in your $50, reserve your law school or dorm. Now, $50 doesn't seem like a lot to you today, but to then, 1970, it seemed like a lot to me. So I said, why should I actually send in 2 $50 checks? I'll send in 1 $50 check to the law school dorm people, because surely they will tell the law school I'm coming, because why would I need a law school dorm if I'm not coming? I had taken a course in logic at Duke, and I thought that would seem very logical. It didn't really work. So when I showed up in the law school the first day, I said, here I am, David Rubenstein, full scholarship recipient. They said, well, you didn't send your $50. We gave that to somebody else. I said, well, wait a second. Why would I need a law school dorm? I gave them $50. And he said, well, that's a different department of the university. We never talked to them. So I didn't know whether I'm going to cry. And finally, they didn't want somebody to do any of those things. They said, okay, we'll figure out, we'll give you the scholarship. So I've been very grateful to them. I've now given them about $65 million in scholarship money to make up for it. So I did okay in law school, not a superstar. Nobody was saying that I was going to be the next Clarence Darrow or Edward Bennett Williams, but I got a good enough job so that I got a summer internship at a very famous firm in New York called Kravis, Swain & Moore. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. Very famous, fairly waspy firm. And I got a summer job. My parents, of course, didn't know Wall Street firms. I didn't know anything about Wall Street either. But I got there, and the first day, I'm sharing an office with somebody that seemed typical. His name was R. Francis Snodgrass III. Now, when I grew up, there weren't a lot of R. Francis Snodgrass III's, but I'm sharing an office with him. I'm the summer associate. And I take off my jacket, and he said, what the hell is that? I'm cleaning that up a little bit. And because I didn't really know, I had gone out and bought 12 short-sleeve white shirts. I figured summer in Wall Street, you wear short sleeves. My father, a blue-collar worker, he had short sleeves in the summer, and you don't apparently need short sleeves. You wear long sleeves. So he kind of said, we don't have short sleeves and cravat. So I had to go out and throw my 12 short-sleeve shirts out. And ultimately, I didn't really want to go there because I thought it probably wasn't, going to rise up there. So I went to another firm when I graduated called Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton & Garrison. And the reason I went there in part was because it was an unusual firm in New York those days. It was half Jewish, half not Jewish. The firms were kind of divided in those days. And also there was Ted Sorensen. He was the man who wrote that great speech with John Kennedy, the inaugural address. I figured some of his, luster would rub off on me. And I worked for him for a number of years. And after a while, I kind of said to him, well, I want to go serve my country, go in the White House and be a senior advisor as you did. And around the same time, that people in the firm said to Ted Sorensen, if you can get this guy a job, get him a job, because we want him out of the firm. He's not that good a lawyer. And I said to my clients, I might go work in the White House one day. And they said, the sooner the better. So it was a big advantage knowing that I wasn't that good a lawyer. So I went to Ted Sorensen did everything he could to get me a job, and he said he got me a job as the chief counsel for a man who was going to be next president of the United States. And I said, okay, so I went to Washington. The job was being chief counsel for Senator Birch Bayh, 1976. Now, he was running. I thought he deserved to be president, but obviously the voters didn't. 30 days after I joined his campaign or joined his Senate staff, he dropped out. Now, some of you may have had experience where you thought your career was about to end. I thought mine was over. I'm going to go work in the White House. I go work for a man, and 30 days later, my political acumen was so bad that he dropped out. So some of you may have had this experience. I got a call out of the blue from somebody I didn't know saying, would you like to work for somebody else running for president? I said, well, geez, I don't know. Well, who is it? He said, Jimmy Carter. I said, that man is never going to be president. They said, well, he has a chance. I said, look, isn't a peanut farmer from Georgia? He's not going to be president. And they said, well, what else have you got to do? I said, well, that's a good point. So I got an interview, and I got hired. I went down to Georgia, and when I went down to Georgia, Jimmy Carter was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. And when I finished, Carter won by 1 point. So Carter said, like, what was your contribution here? Because I was doing pretty well before you showed up. But in any event, as we have observed many times, White House staffs are not filled on merit. They're filled on who worked in the campaign. So I became at the age of 27, the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States, a job I obviously wasn't qualified for 3 years out of law school, but I didn't think President Carter was qualified for this job. Nobody was qualified for the jobs we had. So one of my jobs was to fight inflation. I got it to 19%. Some of you may remember that. No one has done it since. A man named Jay Powell now works for Carlyle for me for 8 years, and he's now the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And I saw him the other night, and I said, look, if deflation is a concern of yours ever, bring me back. I can inflate the economy. But he didn't seem to think that he needed my services. So, so if you get, when you work in the White House, it's a great thrill. Here I am. My parents are blue-collar workers. I got to know the president pretty well, and I'm walking out of the Oval Office, or going to Marine One, just the president and me and Secret Service. And it's a big thrill. Unfortunately, the voters, maybe weren't so happy with what we were doing. We had lots of problems. But there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the White House, which is to say, despite what people tell you about how unpopular you are, you don't believe it because you think because you have all the inside information, you have the best information, whatever you're doing, really in the end, the voters will realize it's the best thing. And so I said, look, I know we've got gas lines, we've got hostages in Iran, we've got my 19% inflation, but surely we're going to win because we're going to be lucky enough to run against a very, very, very old man, a 69-year-old man who can't even get out of bed in the morning. How can anybody get out of bed in the morning when they're 69? Ronald Reagan. Now, I'm 70 years old now, so 69 doesn't seem so bad. It seems like a teenager to me now. But in those days, we thought, no, Reagan was too old. Obviously, be careful what you wish for. We lost. So I figured, okay, I'm not going to be the senior advisor to the president the second term, but that's no problem because I've been asked by so many people to come work for them on the years that they were lobbying me at the White House. They always told me I was a brilliant young man. If you want a job, call me up. Well, I started calling those people the day after we lost the election, and none of them ever called me back. If you want a friend in Washington, as Harry Truman said, get a dog. So all these people were telling me how great I was. When I call them now, nobody wanted to hire me. So I didn't know what to tell my mother because her only child is basically going to be unemployed. So January 20th comes, Reagan is sworn in. I don't have a job yet. January, February, March, April, May, June. I told my mother, look, there's so many offers I have, I don't know which one to sift through. It's taken me forever to sift through all these offers. Well, she said, just take one eventually. So finally, I did get an offer in June. I went back to practice law, and pretty quickly my clients had the same view that my clients had in New York. I'm not a very good lawyer. And there's an advantage of not being good at something because you realize you got to do something else. And so if I was a good lawyer, I'd still be practicing law, and I wouldn't have been able to do other things I've been able to do. So very quickly, my client suggested maybe something else was going to happen and maybe I should do something else. And my partner said, you know, what do you want to do other than practicing law? So I got the hint, and then an idea came to me, and I read something that changed my life. I read about a man named Bill Simon who had done something called a leveraged buyout. He'd bought a company called Gibson Greeting Cards. He basically essentially put in about $1 million and made $80 million in about 2 years. I read that, and I said, I don't know what a leveraged buyout is, but I'm going to do that. It's better than practicing law. So I went down the street to see Bill Miller, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter years, and said, you must know what a leveraged buyout is. Bill Simon, your predecessor, just made a lot of money doing it. Why don't you form a leveraged buyout firm, and I'll be your lawyer, your legal advisor. Obviously, knowing my legal skills weren't that great, he didn't want that. So he said, I don't think I'll do that. And then I read one other thing that changed my life. I read that an entrepreneur will start his or her first company between the age of 28 and 37. If you don't do it by the age of 37, you probably are never going to be an entrepreneur or start a company. And I read that when I was 37. So I said, uh-oh. So I basically said, okay, I'm going to start the first leveraged buyout firm in Washington, D.C., and I did. And I recruited 3 people. I mumbled I had some money, but when they showed up, I said I meant to say I was going to get the money. I didn't really have it. And so I went out and raised from 4 investors, $5 million. And we started the firm, and we called it Carlyle. We named it after the hotel in New York because my partners liked the image of it, but we really had no connection to Carlyle, the hotel. And so we got lucky. We made some mistakes in the beginning, but we built a firm that became one of the larger private equity firms in the world. And we did it by having a good track record, but we had an idea that I'd had that really changed the face of private equity, and it won't strike any of you as brilliant, but essentially private equity firms were very modest operations in the 1970s and 80s, and I came up with the idea of building a kind of a global organization and a multidiscipline organization, not unlike T. Rowe Price or Fidelity had done, which is to say have a buyout fund, a growth capital fund, a venture fund, a real estate fund, and then centralize the administrative kind of apparatus, and then have a global organization, have it all over the world. And I spent many years running around the world raising the money and recruiting the people to do it. And we built a very large firm. And then at one point, Forbes wrote an article pointing out my partners and I were extremely wealthy by any normal human standards, not by the Bill Gates standards, which is in a different world, but by normal human standards, we made a lot of money. And around that time, Bill Gates called me and said, would you be willing to sign the Giving Pledge, which says you're going to give away half your money? And I said I would be willing to do that because I said, look, I got very, very lucky in life, and I'm not sure with my last name and my modest background, I would have been able to do this in some other country. And so I began the process of starting to give away money in the philanthropic effort. And like all of you who are lucky to have enough money to give away or do other things that help in philanthropy, you can do many different things, and typically I would do education and medical research and cultural kind of things. And then I stumbled into something that I've called patriotic philanthropy, which is not to say that other philanthropy is not patriotic. All philanthropy is really patriotic. But this is something that's designed to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. And so I began the effort to do this by happenstance. I went to New York to see a viewing of the Magna Carta. I didn't really realize you could buy the Magna Carta. It turns out you can. There are 17 copies of the Magna Carta in various versions of it. One of them had been bought, the only one in private hands, by Ross Perot in the early 1980s. It was a family had it in its possession for 500 years. They went land poor. He sent his lawyer over. The lawyer negotiated a deal, rolled it up in a tube, goes back through British Customs. They say, what's in that tube? He says, oh, the Magna Carta is in the tube. Sure, go ahead, true. So they didn't believe him, but it was the Magna Carta. He put it on display at the National Archives, and then he ultimately decided to put it up for sale. He was likely to go to somebody from outside the country. The curator at Sotheby's told me. So I said, all right, I'm going to go back the next night and buy it. And I got there, and I, not really a big art collector then, so I didn't really know Sotheby's. They put you in a little room, and then they lock the door, and they start the auction. And if you've been in auctions, you get carried away. And I started bidding and bidding and bidding. Finally, they said, sold. I didn't know who bought it, and they came in and said, you just bought the Magna Carta. Who are you? And I told him, I said, can you afford this? He said, yes. I said, okay, you can slip out the side door if you want, or you can tell these 100 reporters what you're going to do with the Magna Carta. And I said, well, I'm happy to tell them. What I'm going to tell them is this. And I did tell him that I came from very modest circumstances. I got very lucky in life, and now I want to make a down payment on my obligation to give back to this country. And so I'm going to give this to the country, and then ultimately it'll stay here forever, because it's important to stay here because it was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence and other things that we did to begin this country. And I began the process of buying other historic documents that you heard for the same reason, and fixing historic buildings like the Washington Monument and so forth. Now, why is it important to do this? Well, the truth is the government doesn't have as much money as it should for so many of these things, but also, why is it important to see the original of the Magna Carta, the original Declaration of Independence, the original of the 13th Amendment, or visit a Mount Vernon or Washington Monument that's actually in good shape? Well, it turns out the human brain is not yet so evolved that it sees something on a computer screen the same way as it sees the original. If you go see the original Magna Carta, before you go there or after you go there, you're very likely to study it and know more about it. If you just see it on a computer screen, you might not spend much time on it. So by making these things accessible to people, and by letting people know that they can go visit the Mount Vernon or Monticello or Montpelier or James Madison's home, learn more about these people, more likely they will be educated more about American history, and hopefully the phenomena that I mentioned earlier about people not knowing about history will gradually change. And so I just want to say to all of you that I'd just like to remind people that philanthropy is a derivative of an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. We have bastardized the word philanthropy by just listing people who give away a lot of cash as being philanthropists. The truth is, you can give your time, your energy, and your ideas, and they're just as valuable. And the most valuable thing you can give is time. You can't get more time. You can always get more money if you need it. You can come up with more ideas, but you can't get more time. And so I encourage people to look back on what they can do to give back to our country. All of us are very privileged to be in this country. We are not a perfect country, for sure. Lots of problems, lots of challenges, for sure. We could spend days talking about those. But it is the best country on the face of the earth. We have many advantages here. And by reminding people of the pluses and minuses of our country, and educating people about our country, and giving back to our country, I think all of us will be better people for it. Now, if that isn't enough for you, think about this. It's my theory, and on good authority from talking to a lot of theologians, that those people who give back to our country will live a longer life. Because happy people live longer. Grumpy people don't live as long. So if you're happy, when you give to other people and you help other people, nobody says, I just did something in a food kitchen to serve food for people on Thanksgiving. I hate myself for doing that. I just gave some scholarships to kids who can barely afford to go to school. I hate myself for doing that. You feel better about it. And when you give back to society, in the end, I think you're going to feel much better about yourself. And then if that isn't enough incentive, I have good authority as well that you will have a special place in heaven reserved for you if you give back to our country. Now, you might say that's not true. How can I prove that? Well, why would you want to take a chance that I'm wrong? I could be right. So think about this incident that happened in 1882, I think it was. Alfred Nobel is sitting down to his breakfast table in Stockholm, and he's reading his obituary. The newspapers, what I guess you could call it, was fake news. They wrote, Alfred Nobel has died, the merchant of death is gone, the guy who invented dynamite is no longer with us, thank God he's gone, he was terrible. Well, he didn't like reading that. And actually, it turned out that his younger brother had died, Ludwig, and they got it wrong. So he came up with the Nobel Prizes. So I ask all of you to think about this. If your obituary was going to be in the newspaper tomorrow, and of course it won't be for 20 or 5 years or 50 years, but if it were to be tomorrow, would you be happy with what you're likely to read? And if you could write your obituary, what would you want? Well, obviously, everybody can always do more with their life, so I just encourage people to think about, when you leave today, what you might be able to do a little bit more than you've already done, what more you can do to give back to our country, what more you can give back to society, so that when your time does come and you get to that special place in heaven, your children, your grandchildren, your partners, your spouses, whoever is dear to you will think better of you, and you will think better of yourself. Now, I mentioned the speech that John Kennedy gave in 1961, January 20th, 1961. It was a great speech. And he ended it by saying that, in effect, all people can only do a certain amount of things in history. God can't make it possible for us to do everything. You have to do it on your own. So I would like you to think about what you might be able to do to make this society slightly better than it is today, and to make this country slightly better than it is today. We're only on this earth for a very short period of time. And we don't know why we're here and how we got to be here and so forth. That's a more complicated issue. But while the period of time we're here, try to do something that you will be proud of having done. Give back to your society, your community, give back to your country, and make it possible for people to say, this person really made a difference with his or her life. This person we're very lucky this person lived because he or she really did something for our country that is really notable. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know about you, but I've been very excited about today's program. I've been reading and trying to study up on Mr. Rubenstein, and you've blown me away. It was magnificent and inspiring and self-deprecating, all of that. So thank you very much. I want to remind all of you, if you have any questions, to please remember to fill out the card, hold it up quickly so our volunteers can pick it up. And now we really are coming to a favorite part of the program. I'd like to introduce our students who are here today. We have questions that will come directly from our students. This is something they've been working on. It's unfiltered and a question that is really of interest to them. So I'd like to ask our first student from Florida Atlantic University to stand and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi. That sounded weird. My name is Nick Montero. I'm a junior at FAU. So you've collected some of the most important civic documents in history. What factors play a role in your decision? And besides the Magna Carta, is there anyone that stands out to you as the most meaningful in your collection?
Okay. The first part of the question was, I got the most meaningful was what was the first part?
How do you choose?
Okay, choose. Okay. Well, let me talk about the most meaningful for a moment. In 1776, it wasn't clear that there was a majority of support in this country to break away from England. But the Second Continental Congress thought there might be support, and the delegates to the Second Continental Congress ultimately said to those delegates, go back to your states and see if you have permission to break away from England. Right now, you don't have that permission. And as they were leaving, a committee of 5 people was picked to write a statement about what it is that would be the reason we would break away from England. The 5 people in that committee were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and a 33-year-old from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson didn't want to be there. His wife was very ill. Ultimately, she passed away not too long thereafter. And he was a good writer, and John Adams said, well, why don't we have this committee of 5, but you write it, because I'm not that popular. I'm from Massachusetts, you're from Virginia. Virginia should be supportive of the revolution if we go to a revolution. So Thomas Jefferson was given the assignment with 17 days to go. Like most people, he waited until the end. With 3 days to go, he said, okay, now I'll do it. So he sat down and he wrote out something that today some people might regard as a little bit of plagiarism, because in those days plagiarism wasn't considered inappropriate. But he wrote out something, and he wrote out this Declaration of Independence, as we now call it, with a preamble, with all the sins of King George as the second part, and with the resolution to break away. The preamble is the creed of our country in many ways. And the most famous sentence in the English language is in that document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in the ensuing 50 years, he lived 50 years later, 50 years more. He died on July the 4th, 1826, the same day that John Adams died. He never actually defined happiness. And it's hard to see how a man who was a slave owner and had 2 slaves with him when he wrote that could say that all men are created equal. But over the years, that statement has come to symbolize what our country should stand for. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It should say all people are created equal with equal opportunities. And that's what we've intended to make it into. And that statement has become really the creed of our country. And so to me, that is the most important document that I own. I own a number of rare copies of the Declaration of Independence. And There are many different copies of that. There's a copy, the perfect copy that you see in the original is faded beyond recognition for a number of reasons, but perfect copies were made, and I own a large number of them, I guess more than anybody else, and I put them on display around the country. And it's really an important document to me. And how I decide what to buy, you have to wait for somebody to sell something. Some things aren't for sale, but I tell you that the Declaration of Independence in its various versions is probably the most important, but the Emancipation Proclamation is also very important. Abraham Lincoln signed that on January 1st, 1863, and he had shaken 2,000 hands that day earlier, because people come to the White House on January 1, they'd shake the hand of the president. His hands were shaking. He got ready to sign it, but his hands were shaking so much he was afraid that people would see a shaky signature. So he waited for his hand to be steady, and he signed it. And that didn't really free all the slaves. It really freed a few number of slaves, but it began the process of correcting the birth defect this country had, which was slavery, and it began that long process. So those are two of the most important documents, and I own numerous copies of each of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our second student.
Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Rubenstein. My name is Macy McDonald. I'm a senior at Florida Atlantic University. I just have one question for you today. The economic divisions in society are growing to levels we have not seen in some time. As someone who's been extremely successful in your own career, how would you suggest we address these issues?
How would I recommend?
Yes.
Okay. Here's what I recommend to young students all the time. Well, number one, work hard. It's possible to do very well, be lucky in life, but generally people win Nobel Prizes are people that work pretty hard, so don't assume luck will happen. So work reasonably hard. You don't need to be brilliant. Brilliant people are hard to manage and hard to get through all the other challenges of being brilliant. I've hired geniuses many times, and I've fired geniuses many times. So hard work. Learning how to focus on one or two things. Make yourself a master in something before you spread out and become too diffused. Learn how to read. Sadly, now of course you know how to read, but sadly 32 million people in this country cannot read above the 4th grade level. 14% of the people in this country are functionally illiterate. And I don't mean because they came from another country. They can't even read their own language in their own country. 14% of people in this country cannot read past the 4th grade level. And there's another problem, which hopefully none of you will have, which is illiteracy, which is to say you know how to read, but you choose not to do so. 30% of college graduates in our country never read another book in their life. And they just choose not to do so. And reading, I tell people, learn how to read books. Books concentrate the mind. I try to read 100 books a year to concentrate the mind. Focus, focus, focus. Also, learn how to persuade people. All of life is about persuading other people to do what you want. Your spouse, your partners, your business colleagues, your teacher. How do you persuade people? You persuade people by learning how to communicate orally. You can be an effective speaker like Martin Luther King, perhaps. Or learn how to write. Learn how to write very well. You can persuade people, like Abraham Lincoln did, or learn by example. You can persuade people by doing what you think they should do, and people will follow you. I also tell young people what you should learn how to do is get along with other people. Nobody can do anything by himself or herself. Even Albert Einstein needed people to help him come up with E = mc squared. Also, try to be ethical. When I started practicing law, the head of the firm came in the first day and he said, it takes 5 minutes to ruin your reputation, a lifetime to build it. So I tell students, make sure you're highly ethical. And then also I tell students, if you want to be successful in life, make sure you know what you're trying to do and why you're doing it. If it's just to make a lot of money just for the sake of having money, not so important. Figure out how to give back to society and you'll be a much happier person. So those are the skills that I tell people they should try to develop. And in the end, I think good students are the ones that really pursue those kind of things, and the people I hire often have those kind of skill sets.
Thank you. This is a nice segue. So it's been said that you consume about 8 newspapers a day and books, numerous books per week. You've said 100 a year. What titles are you currently juggling? What's your favorite book from your childhood? And what's a must-read right now?
Well, I'd say The American Story is a must-read. I'd say, I'll tell you one more story from it. This may surprise some of you. There's a terrific writer named Scott Berg. Scott Berg, he wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Lindbergh. Lindbergh was the most famous man who ever lived on the face of the earth at a given time. Now, you may say, how can he be more famous than Jesus Christ or Prophet Muhammad or Napoleon? Well, here's what happened. When Lindbergh landed in Bourget Field in 1927, it was the first time the world had been linked electronically, really. So as soon as he landed, everybody in the world knew about it. And so it wasn't like 1,000 years before or 500 years before when something was great done in Europe, nobody in Asia would know about it. Everybody instantly knew what Lindbergh had done, and everybody was proud. Even though he was an American, the French were excited, the Asians were excited. It was an incredible feat. And he became a person who was besieged for the rest of his life for attention. And of course, as we know, his first child was kidnapped and killed. And he tried very hard to live a life without publicity. So Scott Berg was given access to the Lindbergh papers and wrote the definitive biography of him. And then after the book came out and won the Pulitzer Prize, he got a letter. And the letter said, well, your book maybe won the Pulitzer Prize, but it really isn't complete. And you need to meet with me so you can know why it's not complete. So you get a lot of crank letters from time to time. I get letters from people all the time saying, would you like to buy another copy of the Magna Carta? Yeah, I have one for sale. So there's lots of letters you get from time to time. But anyway, he decided he would meet with this person. And he met with the person. The person said, well, here's why your book wasn't complete, even though it won the Pulitzer Prize. Charles Lindbergh had 7 children out of wedlock with 3 German women, and I'm one of those children. And you should have written about us. And he said, I didn't know about it. And it turned out that Lindbergh had managed to have affairs with 3 German women, 2 of whom were sisters, and he had affairs at the same time with them. And he had these 7 German children. So, you never know what you're going to learn when you dig into something or when you write a book. So that's one book I highly recommend, not for that reason. Another book I highly recommend is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by a book called The Hemings of Monticello. And the Hemings of Monticello won the, it's written by Annette Gordon-Reed. And Annette Gordon-Reed, she was the person who proved, I think, pretty definitively that Thomas Jefferson, for all of his great strengths, had an affair with Sally Hemings that went on for 30 years. And let me just tell you a bit about it, just in 30 seconds. How did Thomas Jefferson have an affair with a slave for 30 years? Well, was it rape? Was it consent? Was it a romance? Was it a love affair? Well, we'll never really know. Sally Hemings was probably illiterate. She never wrote anything about it. We don't have any pictures of her. And Thomas Jefferson never mentioned her in the 20,000 letters that we have of his. But what happened was quite interesting. Thomas Jefferson was married to a woman named Martha Wayles, W-A-Y-L-E-S. Her father was John Wayles, a slave owner. And many slave owners were also people who impregnated slaves in those days. It was relatively common. So Thomas Jefferson becomes ambassador to France. He moves over to France, and his oldest daughter, he had 2 surviving daughters. His oldest daughter was with him. His youngest daughter was 6 at the time he moved over, too young to go. When she's 9, he called for her. She didn't really remember him, and she didn't want to go. But eventually, they got a young woman to take this woman, his daughter, over to see Thomas Jefferson. That woman was Sally Hemings. And Thomas Jefferson saw Sally Hemings as a 16-year-old in France. And what he was seeing was probably his wife as a young woman, because Sally Hemings' mother had been impregnated by John Wayles. So the man who was Sally Hemings' father was also the father of Thomas Jefferson's wife. And Sally Hemings was 7th, 8th white. So he saw probably his wife as a 16-year-old. And I should point out, the age of consent in Virginia in those days was 12, up from 10. So Thomas Jefferson began this 30-year affair with her, had 6 children, 4 who lived their adulthood. And, we'll debate for a long time why that happened. Anyway, I highly recommend that book as well, if you want a book on history. And another book I highly recommend is obviously Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's a spectacular book about Abraham Lincoln, probably our greatest president, the president who really kept the country together. And when you read that book and you read other things about Lincoln, you realize how close he would have come to surviving if one thing had happened. If you saw the movie Lincoln, that was based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, and it's only about 5 pages in the book that he deals with, that's dealt with in the movie. But what happened the night of the assassination was this. A couple of days earlier, Abraham Lincoln had gone with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, to visit the troops in Northern Virginia after the war had basically been declared over. And he went with him with Ulysses S. Grant and Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia. Mary Todd Lincoln had a complicated personality. She was yelling a lot. She was yelling and screaming at people. And so Julia Grant said, I don't really want to be around that woman very much. It's too complicated. When they come back the day of April the 15th, Abraham Lincoln has a headache that day, doesn't want to go to the Ford's Theater, but he was told by his aide, well, people were told you're going to go, so you'll disappoint him if you don't go. So he said, okay, I'll go with somebody. He asked Ulysses S. Grant if he'll go. The message went out to him. Grant told his wife, we're invited by the president to go with him tonight to see our American cousin at Ford's Theater. She said, I don't want to be with that woman. I don't want to be with Mary Todd Lincoln. Get an excuse to get out of town. And they did. They went to New York. And so had Ulysses S. Grant gone, maybe with all the military that he had surrounding him, maybe John Wilkes Booth wouldn't have gotten in there, maybe history would have been different. Same thing is true with John Kennedy. The day that he was assassinated, it was raining, and the sun was about to come out. They weren't sure. So Kenny O'Donnell, who was the chief of staff to the president, was asked by the Secret Service, should we take the bubble top off? And it's raining, so maybe we should keep it on. And then they said, no, we should take it off. People want to see the president. Had the bubble top stayed on, and had the route not been printed in the newspapers that day, maybe history would have been different. But anyway, that's the way history unfolded in both those cases.
Thank you. History shows political figures demonstrating courage in the face of adversity. You talk about that extensively. Do you have one or two accounts of extreme courage by contemporary political figures that stick with you?
I couldn't hear, when you get older, your hearing isn't that good, so I couldn't hear that question. No,
Want me to ask another question?
Political courage is, John Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage. All of you are familiar with it. And it was a book about the senators who showed courage in the face of political problems. And we do have, I like to make fun of members of Congress from time to time, but the truth is it's a terrible job. It's very tough. They get paid $180,000 a year. They have to have 2 homes. 75 members of the House of Representatives have to live in their offices because they can't afford a second apartment in Washington, D.C. There are many times when members of Congress have done things that are politically difficult to do, I'd say, and there are many times when presidents have done things that are politically difficult to do, and I would say every president faces all that, and I don't want to cite one or two examples, but clearly when Truman fired MacArthur, that was very difficult to do, for sure. When John Kennedy dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis, now some of you may remember living through that. My teacher told me, I'm not giving you any homework because we're not going to be here tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And John Kennedy decided to ignore what his military advisor said and to not bomb, which probably would have led to a nuclear confrontation, and it ultimately did a quarantine that worked out, and that was very courageous in my view for him to do that. But I would say on politics, and you didn't ask about it, but I would say in the economy, people asked me earlier about it, I would say the U.S. economy is in reasonably good shape. A lot of people take credit for it. I don't know who deserves the most credit for it, but right now, I think this economy is going to be pretty good for 2020, probably be helpful with the president, and if I had to bet today, I'd say he's more likely to get reelected than any other possibility I can see, for better or worse, whatever you think of them. The economy is good, and presidents that don't get reelected generally are running in recessions. Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, George Herbert Walker Bush. The last president who got reelected when there was a recession was William McKinley, and he got assassinated afterwards. But if economies are good, presidents tend to get reelected, whatever other problem they have. And if they're not in a war and the economy is good, they generally tend to get reelected.
All right. Tell us, how can the U.S. remain vital? How can the U.S. remain vital and relevant as our global influence, geopolitical and economic, is under attack?
Well, it's clear that the image of the United States overseas is different than it was before. There's no doubt. I'm the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. I spend a lot of time on these issues. I do think that our allies around the world look at us differently than they did before, for better or worse. And I think many of our competitors overseas look at us much differently. And I would expect that we need to be much more supportive of our allies if we're going to have them rely on us. And I think we just need to not walk away from international issues as much as we might be inclined to do so, because in the end, the United States is the only country that has the military and political capability to solve some of these problems. But right now, around the world, there's an uncertainty about what the United States resolve is on some of these issues.
I heard you talk with Steve Case.
Yes.
Talk about asking for money and why you shouldn't apologize and what you shouldn't be afraid of.
Oh, well, let me put it this way. How many people here in the last month have asked somebody for money for a philanthropic, political, or business purpose, or been asked for money for a political, philanthropic, or business purpose? How many people? Okay. So, that's why I say my favorite song is Money Makes the World Go Round. Because the truth is everybody's always asking for money and so forth, and I don't think it's such a terrible thing to ask for money. I was doing an event with Steve Case when we were talking about it, and I often say that, when the PhD was invented, it was said that you had to have 2 foreign languages to get a PhD, in addition to whatever your native language was. They should have said it should be, that you should actually have to take a course in fundraising, because most people who are academic have to spend a lot of time begging for money, and most people in the world have to ask people for money or figure out how to not give money or give money to people who ask you for money. So I just say that fundraising isn't a course that we actually teach. If you go to Harvard Business School or Stanford Business School, they don't actually teach fundraising, even though so many people in the business world actually do fundraising and ask people for money. And my point in that comment was, if you're not happy to ask somebody for money, don't ask for money. You shouldn't say, I'm sorry to ask you for money, but let me ask you for money. You should actually, if you think it's a good cause, you should, be pleased to ask people for money. But in the end, the hardest thing to do is to ask people for money for, philanthropic things. Political is not that hard because the amount of money, relatively speaking, is modest compared to other things. In business, you're theoretically giving people a return on what they're giving with you, money they're giving you. Philanthropic is more complicated because you don't know whether you're truly going to get to heaven by giving this money or not. But in the end, I think good fundraisers can promise a place in heaven to those people that give money.
All right. I want to thank our audience for so many insightful questions. We could be here all afternoon, and I'm going to do the last question. Aside from Donald Trump, what are your 3 favorite interviews?
I interviewed Jeff Bezos. We had about 1,000 people in an audience, maybe 2,000 people in the Economic Club in Washington. It was a very funny interview. He had a great sense of humor, and I'd known him for a long time because when he was starting his company, my firm, Carlyle, owned the 2nd biggest book distributor in the United States, a company we'd bought that we'd bought from W.R. Grace. It was started in 1839, called Baker & Taylor, had not made a profit since 1839. It was always a break-even company, but it had the biggest bibliography of books in print. And so Jeff Bezos shows up on our doorstep and said he's going to sell books over the internet, but he didn't have a bibliography of books in print, so could we rent ours? And our smart salesman said, well, we don't really rent it out. He said, well, I'll give you 1/3 of a new company I'm starting to, if you let me use it. And we said, no, we're too smart for that. So we So we rented it for $100,000 a year for 5 years. So I'm reading the newspapers. I didn't really know much about it. I'm reading the newspapers, and I read that there was a company selling books over the internet that would maybe be using the same kind of bibliography. So I called a salesman and said, hey, maybe there's another idiot that would give us $100,000 a year for renting this bibliography, which costs us nothing. He said, no, that's the idiot that I already rented it to. I said, oh. Then eventually, about a year later, I said, this company's going to get somewhere. So I flew out to see Jeff Bezos. He was in his ramshackle office, very, very small. In those days, if you ordered a book over the internet, he would order it over the internet from the publisher. The publisher then sent it to him. He would then package it up and take it himself to the post office. So I renegotiated the deal. I said, Jeff, I think I'll take 1/3 of your company now. And he said, well, geez, I don't really think I need you quite as much. But I tell you what, you were helpful in the beginning. I'll give you 1% of the company, which today is worth about $1.1 billion. Is that right? Yeah, no, it's worth about $10 billion, $10 or $11 billion today. So he gave us 1% of the company. But at the IPO, we sold it for $65 million. So that was my biggest mistake. So my son-in-law is here also. When he was in Phillips Exeter, he was a classmate of a guy named Mark Zuckerberg. And when they were college classmates as well, my son-in-law-to-be said, would you like to meet with Mark Zuckerberg? He's going to drop out of Harvard and raise some money, and you could invest in it. And I said, well, that company's not going to get anywhere. I don't think so. So. Anyway,
wow. Well, thank you. We absolutely loved having you.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, very much. Thank you. Everyone, happy holidays, travel safe, and we'll see you in 2020.